Welcome to the PowerPoint on early neighborhood theories and crime. Early neighborhood theories are part of a group of theories that we call social disorganization theories. This is the first part of a two-part lecture. The second part of the lecture covers later neighborhood theories of crime. Let's get started. The work on neighborhoods and crime really begins with Durkheim, who was a famous sociologist. Durkheim had an argument that it was rapid social change that was associated with increases in crime due to the breakdown of social controls, and this left individuals with anomie. The University of Chicago Sociology Department used this idea to begin studying rapid changes in neighborhoods in Chicago in the early 1900s. And this ultimately led to the first large-scale study of crime in the United States. And along with this first large-scale study, also came the first mass collection of data. This research applied theories of relationships from plant ecology, of all things, to human ecology. And this was what became known as the Chicago School of Human Ecology. As I mentioned before, the idea of ecology came from plant ecology, but it developed into human ecology. So ecology is defined as the scientific study of systems of plant life and animal life and their coexistence in natural habitats, including the careful equilibriums that allow the system to continue to exist. The interdependent interrelationships of plants and animals are not so different from those of human communities under this theory. So just like plants and animals help each other live by animals fertilizing the soil and plants growing out of the soil and animals eating the plants and then leaving the fertilizer. The human ecology view of neighborhoods says that what one part of the neighborhood disposes of or doesn't find valuable, another part of the neighborhood uses, that people are interdependent in their interactions. This is really the key thought of it, that people are interdependent in their interactions and that neighborhood socialist systems have lives of their own that are dependent on each part of the community. So business is important to communities, libraries are important to communities, schools are important to neighborhood communities, and the people that make them up also form networks around these different parts of the communities. So that's the human ecology view of neighborhoods that is important to understand as the foundation for this type of theory. So let's talk about Chicago in 1914, which is in the when the human ecology idea of neighborhoods starts to develop at the University of Chicago. Chicago in the early 1900s was a city of change. The population had doubled each decade between 1860 and 1910 due to huge waves of immigration. With these waves of immigration also came industrialization and migration from small towns and rural areas within America. So the mixture of people that were finding themselves in Chicago at the time, people who had grown up in Chicago, new migrants from other areas in the United States, and new migrants from areas outside of the United States, were creating a lot of chaos and unpredictability in the city, and we're also creating new hierarchies. The old social hierarchies were dissolving, and new social hierarchies were being put in their place. And the human ecology view of how this affected neighborhoods in Chicago was saying that the symbiosis or the mutually beneficial relationships that had coexisted in these small neighborhoods broke down in some areas, but not in others. Some of the new neighborhoods, some of the neighborhoods were new, and because they were settled in previously unoccupied land. And other of the neighborhoods formed by invading previously inhabited areas and dominating them, and then in turn later on being dominated by other groups that were coming in. So it was a very cyclical process. An area would have existing residents, new migrants would come to the area. First, they would be small groups, then they would come in larger numbers. Those new migrants would then form the backbone of the community, and then another wave of migrants would come in and start being a minority and then become the majority in a district. And so this is what was happening in both the areas that were first settled in the early 1900s in Chicago and the neighborhoods that had been settled earlier than that. And again, when we talk about migrants, we're talking about people both from America and not from America. Both groups had the same effect on the existing neighborhoods in Chicago. Outside of Chicago, these same migration and immigration patterns were seen in other cities like New York, but also in DC. For example, if you want to think about the area of Georgetown, which many of you have probably been to, once Georgetown was actually a port, and it was dominated by the families of the port workers. And so it was not a rich area at all. It was a very poor area. And during that time, as port workers switched from being primarily Caucasian to being primarily African American, the area of Georgetown actually became primarily African American. And if you ever go walking in Georgetown on a Sunday morning, you may notice that there is actually a predominance of African American churches in Georgetown, and that's why. That historical legacy of churches that were formed in the early 1900s by African American residents who lived in Georgetown are the reason why those churches are still there. And then later periods of migration actually was when white people came back to Georgetown. So the racial patterns of Georgetown today are primarily Caucasian. But that's an example of the same idea of urban ecology. Different groups dominating one area of a city, and first starting out as a minority, then becoming the majority in area. So you, as I said, you can see it in Chicago, you can see it in DC, you can see it in New York. Most of the time, these neighborhoods included internal symbiosis, which is the idea that people trade. Butchers would trade bakers, and bakers would trade with clothiers. They trade bread for clothes. But an external symbiosis existed as part of the city overall most of the time. So if a neighborhood was very well known for producing shoes, for instance, that neighborhood might trade with individuals in another neighborhood that was very well known for producing dinnerware, perhaps. So there was internal trade in the neighborhood, but there was also external symbiosis. When we start to look at neighborhood change in the ecological models, the process of creating enclaves or changing neighborhoods from commercial to residential, followed the pattern of invasion, dominance, and succession. Burgess stated that communities change in what he labeled zones, which start at the center and move in concentric circles out from the business district. So the center circle of a neighborhood is zone 1. It is the business district. And zone 2 is the next concentric circle out from the business district. It typically has some buildings that are already dilapidated, and most of the time this area in contemporary sociology and criminology is thought of as an area that will continue to be a little forlorn and that will be quote unquote let go. This is so the buildings can be torn down to make room for more new businesses, offices, or homes later on. And zone 2 is really thought of as the least desirable part of the city, and it is the part where the poorest residents typically live, and a lot of times that means that it's both immigrants and migrants who are living in zone 2. Zone 3 is the next concentric circle out. It consists of relatively modest homes. Zone 4, the concentric circle after that, is more expensive homes. And zone 5 is the final circle out, is the suburbs, which is really thought of in this model as a commuter zone. Only commuters live there. In the 1920s, Clifford Shaw was working as a probation officer in Chicago, and he thought that rather than being the result of physical or psychological differences, delinquent youth were the result of quote-unquote detachment from conventional groups as the result of the environments they lived in. So Shaw set out to study these neighborhoods, and he found that even the quote-unquote worst neighborhoods had only about 20% of the youths in them that were labeled delinquents. Shaw, along with McKay, found that 3 factors influenced these quote-unquote bad neighborhoods. One was their physical status. They were right next to areas of heavy industry. They contained lots of condemned buildings, and their population was decreasing. The second was economic status. There were a high percentage of these families that lived in these neighborhoods that were receiving social assistance. There were a low percent of the families in this type of neighborhood that were earning above the median income for a city. So essentially they were a very small percentage of upper middle class or upper class income individuals. There was a low percent of families owning homes. There was a high rate of infant deaths due to infection in particular. Shaw and McKay found that people themselves did not cause these conditions, though. These conditions were the result of these groups, the groups that were the primary occupants of these areas, lacking privilege and status in society. The third key element was the composition of the population. Most of the population in these communities were foreign-born, and Shaw and McKay found that each group in an area contributed equally to the delinquency rate. So it wasn't that one group in particular was responsible for the delinquency. It was not like in a neighborhood that was made up of African American, Czech, Italian, Polish, and Slavic people, that one of those groups was responsible for the delinquency. Each of those groups had an equal number of delinquents. Okay. Ultimately, Shaw found that the delinquency rate was due to there being a lack of neighborhood control. And when we talk about neighborhood control, what we mean here is that no one knows each other in a neighborhood due to high turnover. And that creates social disorganization. So if there are a lot of people moving in and out of a neighborhood, you don't know your neighbors, you don't know the people across the street, and that leads to there not being a strong community network there. And this is also facilitated by the fact that there's a large number of immigrants that were living in these areas. And the immigrants had many additional problems, but little in the way of help to address them. So immigrant families may have trouble getting their children to school, they may not speak the language, they may have a more difficult time getting jobs, yet any of the services that people who had lived in the city for longer might rely upon in order to address these issues, such as going to employment or unemployment agencies or getting schooling, immigrant families would have a harder time accessing due to the fact that they may not speak the language, they may not know that these opportunities exist, they may come from cultures where there were different social norms, or cultures where they expected these services to cost a great deal, and thus they were reluctant to seek them out, even if they were aware of them. But consequently, the children of immigrant families during Sean McKay's time had higher rates of delinquent youth. There were also many opportunities for delinquent behavior, and normal methods of social controls, which were fairly weak because the community members' relationships with each other were usually fairly weak, were unable to stop these delinquent behaviors after the delinquent behaviors got started. Furthermore, they found that these delinquent behaviors were passed down from boys to boys. And that's not trying to pin this mostly on men, but the research showed that it was mostly young men who participated in the delinquent behavior. So what the research found was that there was an actual system of passing knowledge about how to be delinquent down, and 13, 14, 15-year-old boys would pass that information down to boys who were 8, 9, 10, 11. And it would inculcate those young boys into delinquent behavior, how to perform it, how to not get caught. And evidence from a later study, Miller's study of youth in Chicago, actually suggested that very few interventions, whether we're talking about court system, whether we're talking about alternative channels, whether we're talking about moving these youths to more communities with more social ties, were actually able to lessen the amount of crime that these youths committed once they got started committing crime. In 1978, Kornhauser criticized Shaw and McKay's research, stating that the theory that they had used actually had two separate arguments. One of these components was quote-unquote social disorganization, where delinquency emerged in neighborhoods where the relationship and institutions had broken down. The second component of the argument was the subculture argument, which stated that these behaviors became supported by neighborhood residents. Kornhauser argued that the social organization of the neighborhood was the cause of the delinquency, and advocated a community control model. The argument behind this model was that people who are poor live in racially and ethnically diverse neighborhoods, and due to them moving frequently, will have trouble maintaining normal social relationships and institutions in their neighborhoods. So neighborhoods with high poverty, high diversity, and high residential mobility will also have high rates of crime and delinquency. And Kornhauser reviewed several studies that supported this theory. This theory grew into research on residential succession, and Stark thought that it was the neighborhoods themselves, not the people in them, that led to crime. So Kornhauser thinks that it's really the people in the neighborhoods that leads to crime, and Stark criticizes Kornhauser and says it is not the people themselves, it is the physical neighborhood which is the ultimate cause of the crime. Stark listed 30 features of neighborhoods prone to crime, all emphasizing physical aspects of these communities, including the density of the neighborhood, the poverty rate of the neighborhood, the residential mobility of the neighborhood, the number of dilapidated buildings in the neighborhood, and stated that all of these factors, and additional factors as well, breeds what is called moral cynicism, also allows for more opportunities to commit crime, motivates the residents to commit crime more, and contributes to a decrease in the ability to conduct informal surveillance, or neighbors essentially checking on other neighbors' houses, cars, property, telling kids to go away, or to stop doing certain actions that may lead to crime. Sampson also reviewed research on the relationship between neighborhoods and crime and determined that it was the combination of poverty along with mobility that was associated with high levels of violent crime. Poverty alone wasn't enough. And Sampson argued that race drops out as a causal factor once poverty rates were taken into account. Finally, Sampson says that neighborhoods with high population density, many apartments, and high concentrations of single people tend to be more violent. Sampson, in short, viewed social disorganization as the community's inability to agree on a policy and values, and he said that neighborhoods that were very dense, where people lived in apartments rather than in single-family homes or townhomes, and where people were living as individuals as opposed to living as families, were less likely to agree on community values than neighborhoods where it was single family homes where it was mostly families inhabiting these homes. Sampson argued that where there is a lot of social capital, in other words, where relationships among community members are face-to-face, which is more likely in single-family neighborhoods where there are single-family home neighborhoods with lots of families, there is less crime. And he said that even criminals do not want crime in their own neighborhoods. And so when a community, even one that is poor, has relationships among its members that are strong, it will not have high crime. In areas where people do not know each other or cannot form bonds, however, they cannot monitor common areas, and so they will have high crime. So Sampson introduces the term collective efficacy to describe a neighborhood's ability to maintain order in its public spaces, such as streets, sidewalks, and parks. Collective efficacy was found to be related to concentrations of poverty and mixed land use, so buildings that were both apartment buildings and typically on their first and sometimes their first and second floors had businesses. So if you had neighborhoods that had a high amount of poverty and a lot of buildings where the first and second floors of those buildings were businesses and the upper floors were apartments, you were less likely to have collective efficacy. In other words, communities that could agree on the community norms and thus maintain order on the streets and parks. The flip side of that is that if you were in wealthy areas where you had land use that was residential only in single-family home developments, Sampson argues that you have communities that are more able to agree on what the community norms are and thus better able to police streets, parks, and other public areas. One of the most famous advocates of social disorganization theory was James Q. Wilson, who, along with George Kelling, published an article on quote-unquote broken windows policing in 1982. Broken windows policing became widely popular, arguing that neighborhoods that experience social and physical decay will then experience social disorder and then will experience violent crime. So the causal arrow that Wilson draws here is that social and physical decay lead to social disorder, and social disorder leads to violent crime in particular. All right. Today, scholars realize that this relationship may not be accurate or may only apply to some crimes like burglaries or robberies, or that this theory may actually miss the real cause of crime, which is fear of crime. Broken windows policing, however, became the modus operandi in New York City in the 1980s. And it was a strategy where maintenance of order and zero tolerance policing was mandated. So you could be arrested for breaking the law on littering if you were in a community that was physically dilapidated. So what happened in these communities was that it made them incredibly hostile to police. The result of broken windows policing, in most instances, or one of the results of it, was that the communities became to really resent police, and community policing models became very difficult to implement in communities that had had broken windows policing.
You may have heard that people will sometimes complain about public housing units coming to their neighborhood by saying, oh, we're getting a public housing facility and that's going to lead to an increase in crime. Well, if you hear that, or if you hear people talk about how crime increased in their neighborhood after public housing came, you might want to remember some of the research that has been done on crime and public housing. First, there has been investigation into literally the architecture of public housing and how it affects crime. If you have public housing that is very tall with narrow hallways and people who live in it can't see each other, it makes it hard to see each other, it makes it hard to form bonds because everybody's in a hallway and it's not a great place to talk, there's not a lot of green space, people can't see one another when they're leaving their apartment really. Public housing like that, like what's in the picture here, actually has been found to have higher crime rates than the areas that surround it. And a lot of this is thought to be because it makes it hard for anyone to act as a guardian. If something's going on in their neighbor's house or apartment, a lot of times it's really hard for other people to know. And so, nobody's going to call the manager or the police if they don't know something is wrong. This is in contrast to public housing that's only like a story or two high, where there's lots of green space, where people have clear lines of sight between their homes and their neighbors' homes. Public housing that's been designed like that has actually been found to have no difference in crime rates compared to the areas that surround it. So if we want there to not be a higher crime rate associated with public housing, then we need to make public housing that allows for crime rates to remain low. This is really an architectural problem, not a problem created by the people who are in public housing. It is a problem of the architecture of public housing. The other thing that you may have heard about or that you may have read research on is the relationship between guardians and potential victims in public housing. One of the reasons why public housing sometimes is thought to have higher crime rates is because there's been research that's interviewed particularly burglars and asked them why they targeted certain areas. And the burglars replied that they often targeted public housing because they knew that the people who lived there were more likely to be elderly, to be disabled, to be people who were unlikely to contact the authorities. And for all of these reasons, that made it more attractive to burglars. Burglars also mentioned that they thought that the people who were there generally were less likely to contact the authorities, and in fact the burglars banked on that. In other words, there were fewer guardians there. This is to say, architecture can play a really key role in making it that whether there is or is not a difference between the crime rates of public housing and the crime rates of the communities that the public housing is in. We want to have public housing that does not have a different crime rate than the communities that surround it. And we also need to realize that criminals sometimes specifically target public housing because they feel that they are more likely to get away with crime if they perpetuate it on people who live in public housing. And thus we need to make it so that the people who live in public housing feel secure in contacting the managers of the housing facilities, the police, or both, so that they aren't easily targeted.
So looking at neighborhood level theories of crime, there's several kind of legacies that pull out from this theory of crime. Number one is the legacy of inequality. Neighborhoods have a hard time escaping their past, and once criminal cultures are present in the neighborhood, it's hard for the neighborhood to implement norms that reduce crime in it. So this means for both communities who want to prevent crime and the police that in communities that don't have high crime rates already, the goal is to maintain the social norms in those communities and maintain the low crime rate. Second legacy of neighborhood theories of crime can discuss race, crime, and diversity. So there are racial disparities in both crime and the way that the criminal justice system treats criminals. And these disparities may, once they exist, may continue to grow in magnitude, and then they contribute further to disadvantaging neighborhoods. So if there starts off as a little bit of disparity on how a white neighborhood versus how a predominantly black neighborhood is policed, that the criminal justice system can end up exacerbating that existing disparity. And that continued exacerbation of the disparity leads to further disadvantaging the neighborhood, meaning that it might not have enough police force to be put in it. It might be viewed as a continually more hostile environment. It might not receive as much in public funding for education. The neighborhood may experience the flight of businesses from it. So all of these are the result of disparities being magnified. Another legacy of neighborhood theories of crime is that one broken window may not lead to another. So James Q. Wilson's idea was that one broken window leads to another broken window, which leads to an increasingly violent culture in a neighborhood. And what we've found out since then is that one broken window may not lead to another broken window. It really depends on the context. And it also is really important to consider the predominant race of the community where something is physically dilapidated. What studies have shown us is that whites view physical structures and the maintenance of physical structures more closely than other races, and so whites are more likely to associate buildings that look dilapidated with a fear of crime in an area. Other variables that tend to affect whether or not dilapidated buildings are seen as a problem that may lead to crime include education, class, and age. Okay. The next legacy of neighborhood theories of crime is the measurement of collective efficacy. How we measure neighborhood collective efficacy, can be through organizations, including nonprofits that may move in, become present, try to build community structures, community relationships. Technology, social media changes the way communities communicate with one another. And police, building trust with police is the goal of neighborhood policing programs in particular. So we want to enhance collective efficacy as best we can. And then when collective efficacy becomes present, we want to make sure that communities are empowered to act on that collective efficacy. Next, and the final one is that neighborhoods aren't just affected by what happens inside them. They're also affected by what happens around them. And although communities have their own essentially ecosystems, their own ecology, which they are responsible for in to a large degree, the things happening outside of the communities also affect them. So you think about an area that may be full of residents who live below the poverty line, but have strong neighborhood collective efficacy ties with each other, and so are policing the neighborhood themselves, are reporting different things to the police. The bonds within the community are very important for the neighborhood. But that neighborhood is also going to be affected by, let's say, cuts in the police force. If the city decides to cut the police force, that would be an extra local effect. Or if, let's say, that a large number of the individuals on this or in this community are on Social Security or Medicare. If there are cuts to those programs, that will also affect the community and probably its ability to maintain those strong networks of ties with each other.